Hello, girls. Welcome to our continuing series on hesed examples in the Old Testament. Today we're going to be doing the story of Abraham. This presents something of a challenge. Your textbook mainly focuses on God's establishment of the covenant with Abraham, and that shows his continuing hesed. But just if we're talking about giving a brief overview, your textbook provides a chart, which you see here, that gives you some of the main events in Abraham's life. I did add this last part here, the giving of the covenant, because that is central to our understanding of the story of God's hesed love with Abraham. So just to review very quickly, it's the story of a guy named Abram who was called by God and ends up having this long relationship with him, and he's the first of the patriarchs. And from him come these series of stories in the Old Testament telling the stories of the first fathers of Israel. And so if we take a look at our chart, our timeline, you see here that the story of the first covenant and the nations happens over here in the sort of prehistory era. This begins sort of what we would call the historical period. We're going to pick up with Moses here in the Exodus, but the story of the establishment of the covenant with Abraham, and then it continues through his sons, is the story, that kind of starts the history of Israel. It starts setting them aside as a people, and that's one of the reasons why this is so special. As you'll probably recall, you have Abraham, and he has his son Isaac, and Isaac is the father of Jacob, and Jacob is the father of Joseph, and the 12 tribes of Israel. So these are the great patriarchs. And this starts this series of stories of the patriarchs, and then it'll pick up again with the epic of Moses. So that's sort of where we're at. But the story does begin with Abraham. And in the story, Abraham first establishes his relationship with God when he's living in a place called Ur. And Ur was located here on the Persian Gulf. Now, in ancient times, it went much farther. Went ancient times, the Persian Gulf went further down this way. But in any case, he was in this place called Ur, and God calls him and says, Abraham, I want to promise you that you'll have many descendants, as many as the stars in the sky and the sands on the desert. And you just got to follow me. And Abraham, picks up his things, and he says, God leads him, and he says, I'm going to give you this beautiful land and these beautiful descendants. And he ends up following God all the way across the desert into Egypt, and then they'll end up settling in Canaan, which will become the promised land of Moses. And so this, you can see the level of Abraham's commitment. He was able to follow God all the way across the desert and just following God's promise of a son. And so the story of Abraham is just this saga of the patriarch of Israel. And it's really difficult to summarize. If you were going to choose this for your project, you could focus on one of the narratives about Abraham and show the hesed love in just one of the narratives. The main characters would be Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. But it's such a big story for your project, you're going to have to focus on one little element of it. And in terms of trying to interpret it on the allegorical level, it shows the reciprocal relationship between God's hesed love and us in the form of covenant. Now, remember the covenant with Noah? There were no conditions. This covenant with Abraham is the first time we begin to get this idea of condition. And God establishes his covenant with Noah, but Noah has to do something as well. Noah has to do something in return. And God promises Abraham, for his part, has to have the covenant of circumcision. S-I-O-N. So Abraham promises that he will be circumcised. This is where we get that phrase to cut a covenant we talked about earlier. he literally is going to mark his body and mark himself as God's special people. So this is where we get the establishment of the people of God. Why are the Jews God's people? Well, part of the reason why is they have literally marked themselves out as God's people with this ritual of circumcision. And so Abraham promises that he will circumcise himself and all his slaves and all his descendants. And for God's part, God promises that he will have great land and most especially a great tribe or many descendants. And this was something that was shocking to Abraham because Abraham and Sarah were quite a bit older and could not have children. And God kept promising, and Abraham wasn't perfect. He questioned God. He said, when is this going to happen? And eventually they have their son Isaac. And we see the level of Abraham's commitment, not just in the first map I showed you, where he's able to follow God wherever God tells him to go, leaves his family, goes across the desert to Egypt, back into Canaan. But God, in Genesis 22, sort of tests the level of his commitment and asks him to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, the one he had waited forever for. And so Abraham takes him up to the mountain, and he does it. And in Judaism, the name for this story is the akedah, the binding, because he had to bind Isaac and put him on the altar, as you see here. So it kind of shows that Isaac was probably not willing to be sacrificed because he was bound. But it shows on this moral level that hesed requires love and commitment and sacrifice. And obviously not literally sacrificing your children, because an angel comes and stops Abraham. But when we say we love somebody, it's not enough just to say you love them. You got to show it, and you got to have commitment. It's commitment that we see in the covenant, where we literally commit to do things for God, and He commits to do things for us. But it also requires sacrifice of our time and our efforts. And Abraham literally does that. And I think we have to ask ourselves as modern Christians, how can we be like Abraham and be willing to sacrifice our time and our effort the way he does in our daily lives? And on an anagogical level, it sets the stage for Jesus' final sacrifice, the hesed love of Jesus on the cross. Jesus is the final sacrifice. God doesn't just ask Abraham to sacrifice his son. God is going to step into his shoes and sacrifice his own son for us. So this sort of foreshadows the final sacrifice of Christ. So you see God's hesed love embodied in Abraham. You got one little story here about the story of Isaac, but you could look at any of the narratives with Abraham for your project. If you chose this for your project, you could focus on the covenant, you could focus on the akedah, but this has a big narrative. It's a saga. And so if you choose this for your project, choose one little element of Abraham's story that touches you and speaks to you of the hesed love between God and Abraham. So for your code for this lecture, make sure you did take notes. Even if you're not doing your project on this one, it will appear on the test. You do need to know it. So make sure you took notes. You have your other codes from the other lectures. By now, you're probably figuring out what the code word is. But again, don't just skip the lectures because you figured out the code. Please do watch them. Thank you.